Welcome to Novara Live. Coming up tonight, the Iranian foreign minister has warned that letting the US use British bases constitutes participation in aggression. And we speak to declassified UK editor Phil Miller about Britain's role in the war on Iran. Are we complicit? Does that make us vulnerable? Also, analyst Esfandyar Batmanghelidj explains why Trump has bitten off more than he can chew in the Middle East. We do a bit of a deep dive on the economics of this conflict. Incredibly interesting. Plus, we have a special report from Steven Methven. He's in Havana amid the illegal US energy embargo of Cuba. And finally, Bernie Sanders continues his campaign against AI companies. Can he save us all from doom? I'm Michael Walker. I'll be joined in the second half of tonight's show by Richard Hames, host of Novara Media's new show, Do Your Own Research. If you'd like to support our work, you can sign up at novaramedia.com/support. The Iranian foreign minister has warned the UK that letting the US use British bases is participation in aggression. So saying we are part of the war. In a call with UK Foreign Secretary Yvette Cooper, Syed Abbas Aragachchi also demanded that the British government ceases cooperation with the United States. Now, Downing Street has repeatedly claimed that British bases are only being used for defensive rather than offensive action. And this is how the Prime Minister's spokesperson responded to Aragachchi. So he said, well, they said, as a spokesperson, we didn't participate in the initial strikes and we're not getting drawn into the wider war. We have authorized the US to use our bases for a specific defensive and limited purpose in response to Iran's continued and outrageous aggression. And we've always said that this is the best way to eliminate the urgent threat and restore a path to diplomacy. However, an investigation by Declassified at the RAF Fairford Air Base in Gloucestershire makes UK involvement in the Iran war seem not quite so innocent.
There's a significant amount of heavy US bombers stationed here at RAF Fairford. There's several B-52s. Around a quarter to half of the US fleet of B-1s are also stationed here. At one point, we actually saw one of the B-1s taking off, presumably heading over to bomb Iran. We've also seen a number of 2,000-pound bombs just stationed, kind of dotted around the airway here. And earlier this week, some US soldiers were pictured on this airfield transporting those bombs around. And so what we found today when we arrived was that a lot of the fence around the airfield had been tarpaulinged off, basically fenced off, so that journalists and members of the public can actually see into the base to see what's going on here. And that doesn't scream, a defensive operation to me. The US forces, which control this base, are hiding, concealing what they're doing behind the fence.
RAF Fairford is reportedly the only US airbase in Europe with a long enough runway for launching B-1 bombers. And the British base at Diego Garcia in the Kharg Islands has a runway long enough for the US B-2 stealth bombers. They're used to bomb deep inside Iran. And both bases are currently being used by the US in its war against Iran. Now, this is not a role Keir Starmer has been keen to broadcast, as it goes strongly against public sentiment. On the 2nd of March, YouGov asked members of the public what they thought of allowing the United States to use British bases to launch attacks against missile bases in Iran. Now, 50% opposed the move, 29% strongly opposed the move, and only 13% of people strongly supported the government's decision, which has left an opening for the Greens.
Well, I think this is an illegal, reckless war that is certainly being waged by Trump and Netanyahu. I think they have massively underestimated their enemy in this particular occasion. I agree with the man in the front who suggested that. And let's be in no doubt that Trump is a bully and a blackmailer. He's made absolutely no kind of plan for what kind of exit strategy there's going to be. He said we're just going to exit when he feels it in his bones. This is a president who has said he's going to bomb Kharg Island just for fun. He has lazily suggested that he might go and attack Cuba as well. The kind of language that he and Pete Hegseth are using is so disgusting when they talk about, I've got the words here, watch what happens to these deranged scumbags today. What a great honour to kill them.
That was Caroline Lucas on Question Time last night, and today the Green Party's 5 MPs and 2 peers have written to Starmer about the UK's involvement in the war. Their letter calls on Starmer to answer specific questions, including whether an assessment has been made as to how many Iranian civilians have been killed in bombing missions from UK bases. And they also call for Starmer to do the following: So they call for him to withdraw all permission for the US to use UK military bases for attacks on Iran, end all arms sales to and military cooperation with the Israeli government, impose sanctions on government officials responsible for breaches of international law, condemn the actions of Trump and Netanyahu for their flagrant violations of international law, and refuse any further complicity in this illegal war. So, how complicit is the UK in Trump and Netanyahu's illegal war on Iran? Earlier today, I spoke to declassified UK editor Phil Miller.
So Trump is using 2 British air bases. One is called RAF Fairford in Gloucestershire. It's about a 2-hour drive west of London. And the other one is Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean. And from these bases, these huge heavy bombers are able to take off every day and fly on this. From RAF Fairford, it's a very long journey. They seem to be avoiding flying through other countries. So they go down through the Atlantic and the Mediterranean before they cross over Israel and Saudi Arabia to then bomb Iran that way. And these planes are able to carry much heavier payloads of bombs than the fighter jets that are flying out of the Gulf are able to.
And that's interesting, actually. You say they don't want to fly over other countries. Is that because the French or the Germans wouldn't allow them to do it? Why is it that they're choosing to go via an ocean route instead of the more direct route, which would presumably be flying over land?
Yeah, it seems like Britain is one of the most permissive of the allies in terms of letting the US use these bases, and the French have put certain restrictions in place. That's not to say the French aren't helping in other ways, but in terms of overflight of the heavy bombers, they seem to have not allowed that to happen.
Does the UK get to dictate how the Americans use the bases that are here, or is it is the idea that, the US are our allies, if we've given them some land for a base, then they should be able to treat it essentially like American territory?
So the UK is claiming that it has control and that it's given the US permission to only do these defensive strikes, so-called. But when you ask for detail on how they actually police that, they refuse to give any comment on it, which could mean either they're embarrassed about the fact they can't control it, or they don't want to admit what they're allowing to go ahead. So, for instance, at Declassified, we asked the Ministry of Defence whether they have to approve the list of targets before the US planes take off, and whether they're able to audit after the strikes have taken place to make sure they did actually strike those locations. I thought that would be a fairly straightforward question. They just said, we're not going to give you a running commentary. We also asked if they were going to monitor how many civilians were killed as a result of these strikes. And again, they refused to comment on that. They refused to say if they were letting the Americans use banned cluster munitions. So, yeah, there's a whole host of areas where they don't want to comment on.
You've got lots of footage of these enormous bombs, it's sort of 2,000-pound bombs. The UK is saying that whatever these are being used for is defensive. I suppose, a 2,000-pound bomb doesn't sound very defensive. Have they given you an explanation as to what these bombs are being used for? I suppose they say they're taking out missile launcher sites or something along those lines.
Yeah, so they're trying to say that these bombs will only be used against rockets that Iran is firing at the Gulf allies, at like hotels in the Gulf, for instance. And that's the premise on which they're saying it's defensive. But they've actually changed that position slightly and said that the goal is just to stop Iran's ability to fire missiles into the region, which seems incredibly broad. And, obviously Iran has a right to self-defense. It has a right to retaliate against US bases that are being used to attack it. It has a right to retaliate against Israeli military sites that are being used to attack it. And the UK government haven't given any explanation for how they can tell which missile launch sites in Iran they know are only going to be used against civilian targets in the Gulf. These sites could be used against both sites in the Gulf and Israeli sites, or just purely against Israeli sites. But they've not really given any kind of breakdown as to how they're making that distinction, which makes me think that they're not really trying to make that distinction at this stage. And also as well, Michael, you've seen these kind of unhinged statements that the Pete Hegseth, the US Secretary of War, is coming out with, that they don't need to abide by any rules of engagement. So I don't think really the US administration is trying to draw a kind of neat distinction between the different types of targets that they're hitting.
I presume if we were to get someone from the government on and they were being open, as you say, when you ask them direct questions, they're more just evasive than anything. But I think if you were speaking to them privately, and they were sort of explaining their actions, they'd say, look, we've already withheld pressure to actively join this conflict against Iran, and we're getting a lot of flack for that. Our defense as a nation is still, whether you like it or not, it's still reliant on the American security umbrella, and we still want them to arm Ukraine against the Russians. So if we were to not only refuse to join the war, but be very restrictive in terms of what they can do on their bases in Europe, then that would be, picking a fight we can't win. If the government, I imagine they haven't made that argument to you, because it sounds like they're just more evasive to you. But if they were to make that argument, which I think is probably honest, at least, even if you disagree, what would your response be?
I think we've seen the consequences of the UK and European countries not standing up to Trump, in that we now have Israel and the US destroying these gas fields in Iran very predictably retaliating against gas fields in the Gulf, which the UK relies on massively because we've invested so little in gas storage and in our own energy security. And this is going to have a huge impact on ordinary people in the UK for years now. We're going to be seeing higher energy prices, higher food prices, higher prices of almost everything because of this US-Israeli foreign policy that has just been allowed to operate with complete impunity for the last few years. And if the UK had actually stood up to Netanyahu and Trump and Biden before that, earlier on in the Gaza genocide, and actually tried to uphold international law, tried to enforce some red lines, then I don't think we'd have got to the stage that we've got to today, where they're doing potentially decades-long damage to the global economy.
And how does the UK compare to other European countries? Because I suppose they all find themselves in the same bind, which is that Europe, sort of, as it stands, struggles to defend itself and is so somewhat reliant on the United States. Sanchez is obviously the leader that people are most sort of looking at as someone who is rhetorically standing up to Trump. I just looked it up. There are US bases in Spain. Are other European countries being more confrontational with Trump and the Americans when it comes to what the Americans can use their territory to do?
I mean, I think in France, there's been more of a tradition of having an independent foreign policy. France left NATO for many years, which people tend to forget. So I think they're slightly more aware that they can have a different foreign policy that's not just purely based on Atlanticism. The trouble we have in the UK is that we've been in lockstep with the US for so many decades now, and we have all these overseas military bases that we let the US use as well. And so when we hear things like, the Royal Air Force Base on Cyprus was targeted, and that was somehow an attack on Britain, and then a week later it turns out that actually it was a very specific attack on the US hangar on that base, right? And likewise, the base in Bahrain, the US have a huge military base out there. And then a few years ago, the UK built its own military compound right next door to it on the seafront. So when these missiles are coming across the Gulf and landing on the US base, that's why we're being told that UK troops were so near to that impact site, is because we built our base right next door. Likewise, the base in Iraq where UK troops came under fire, I understand that was a US base with some UK troops were staying in it. So I think just the way that we keep operating side by side with the US makes it very hard for us to disentangle ourselves. That's not to say it can't be done. And you point to the example of Spain, where they are able to take a more independent line.
That was Phil Miller speaking to me earlier today. We have a bit of an update as well. Since we went live, the BBC is reporting that the UK has approved the use of its bases for the US to launch strikes on Iranian sites targeting the Strait of Hormuz. So as it stands at the moment, we have been, supposedly saying to the Americans, you can only use our bases, so either sort of in Britain or on Diego Garcia, I'm not sure if the Cyprus base is being used, if you are attacking missile sites, which the Iranians are using to attack British interests in the Gulf. I don't know how the hell they're suggesting that they're holding the Americans to this. It already sounds a bit wishy-washy. But now they're saying if those missiles are, or if those American sorties are being used to attack missile sites or anything that the Iranians are using to attack ships in the Strait of Hormuz, then they can also, use our military bases to do it. So I suppose one could say this is a slippery slope of getting dragged in. I suppose the Brits, Keir Starmer would say, we're still not sending our own troops. We're just saying they can use our capacity or our bases to do this. So very much morally complicit, I suppose Keir Starmer would say, but not particularly strategically exposed, one would imagine. A Downing Street spokesman says ministers agreed today that bases could now be used for, quote, US defensive operations to target, quote, capabilities being used to attack ships in the Strait of Hormuz, which would presumably be everything, right? I don't know if the Iranians are sort of saying, oh, well, this is the kind of missile site we use to attack Israel, and this is the kind of missile site we use to hold up ships on the Strait of Hormuz. I mean, that just sounds like you're letting the Americans use your sites to do anything. I suppose maybe not bomb cities, hopefully. According to an explosive report in Axios, Donald Trump is planning for the complete takeover of Kharg Island. And the report, which is based on statements from 4 unnamed US officials, suggests the move would be part of an effort to open up the Strait of Hormuz. Kharg Island has long been an obsession of the Trump administration. The island, which is located just off the Iranian coast in the Persian Gulf, processes 90% of Iran's crude oil exports. And it's vital for the Iranian oil industry as deep-sea oil tankers can safely embark there. So the immediate Iranian coast in the Persian Gulf is too shallow for those giant tankers. And that means Iran has built pipelines from all its major oil fields. That's transported to Kharg Island, and then that oil is then processed and loaded onto ships via specialized tanker jetties. You can see them there on the eastern side of the island. So could taking Kharg Island be the key that unlocks the Strait of Hormuz? That's what Trump hopes, and the sources who spoke to Axios also think so. So someone described as a source with knowledge of the White House's thinking said this: we need about a month to weaken the Iranians more with strikes, take the island, and then get them by the balls and use it for negotiations. So saying, well, we've got Kharg Island. If you reopen the strait, we'll give it back. Is that what is it supposed to be a hostage situation? I'm not quite sure. Another person described as a senior administration official said this: Trump wants Hormuz open. If he has to take Kharg Island to make it happen, that's going to happen. If he decides to have a coastal invasion, that's going to happen. But that decision hasn't been made. So this is kind of briefings to Axios. I mean, it sounds like to try and make the Trump administration sound very tough. And I don't know if these briefings are the briefings of real plans or they are sort of an attempt to intimidate the Iranians. Either way, not everyone is convinced this kind of economic pressure on Iran would have the White House's desired effect. Esfandyar Batmanghelidj is CEO of the Bourse and Bazaar think tank. He's written a fascinating piece in the magazine Foreign Policy titled "Iran Can Afford America's Economic Warfare." And I spoke to him earlier today to discuss the argument. We talked about Iran's advantage in cheap drone production, how Americans misunderstand the nature of Iran's economy, and how escalation in the Strait of Hormuz would affect prices everywhere throughout the globe. I began, though, by asking about that latest update on Trump's apparent plans to take over Kharg Island.
The president seems to be under a lot of pressure from, I assume, people within his administration, but also figures like Lindsey Graham, who've been very vocal about the idea that taking Kharg Island would be a kind of easy pathway to victory. And the idea here is that, there's a view in Washington that Iran is funding its war through its oil exports. And the island is critical as the main terminal for around 90% of Iran's oil exports. If the US can seize the island, they would be able to basically halt Iran's oil trade. I think there is pressure growing as well because while the Iranians have, quote unquote, closed the Strait of Hormuz, there have been reports that they have been able to move some of their own tankers carrying Iranian crude out of the Persian Gulf and towards customers in China. So that has, I think, wounded some pride in Washington, and also given this impression that, if you are able to halt the oil exports, you might be able to halt Iran's war machine.
Why is that wrong, though, unless you do agree? I mean, from what you've said there, it sounds like if you want to beat Iran, that would be a sensible thing to do.
I think the misunderstanding here that exists among American policymakers, and this is something that's been kind of baked in for a long time, is that on one hand, they misunderstand the composition of the Iranian economy and the size of the Iranian economy. And on the other hand, they misunderstand the kind of efficiency and the sort of small amount of military expenditure that Iran is actually undertaking in order to create this threat and to pursue things like the war that's unfolding right now. And so to give you some more context, I mean, when we look at the composition of the Iranian economy, oil is very important. It is the majority source for Iran's foreign exchange earnings. It is the backbone of government expenditure. However, Iran, unlike other countries in the Persian Gulf, has a diversified economy, and there is a large non-oil industrial sector that is also part of the backbone of the Iranian economy. And so even if you're able to squeeze oil exports, and we have some historical precedent here, oil exports came down dramatically in 2019 in the period in which the Trump administration had first started their maximum pressure sanctions. That doesn't mean that Iran's economy is going to collapse immediately. It does create significant pain, economic pain for the country. But when we're talking about whether or not the war is going to last for weeks or months, Iran will be able to persist in its fight, even if the oil exports are halted. And this leads to the second observation, which is that the reason they can do this is that it is not expensive for Iran to maintain the kind of operational tempo that they have, because Iran is a country that has, relative to other countries in the region, and certainly relative to Israel and the United States, been spending a lot less on its military. So the most recent data we have is for 2024 from the Iranian budget of that year. This is data that's compiled by CIPRI, and if you look at the total Iranian military expenditure, it's $8 billion a year. Now, to put that into context, the Pentagon has reportedly just asked the White House to push forward a supplemental budget addition of $200 billion to fund the Iran war. So Iran is spending a tiny fraction of what its adversaries are, and that has to do with sort of the nature of the capabilities that they've developed in recent years.
Your argument is that these drones that they're using, especially the drones are the cheap things, right, are so cheap that even if you cut off their oil exports, they'll still be able to continue the war. I mean, I suppose there are also 90 million people, and if you cut off the oil exports, yeah, maybe you can still make the drones, but can you keep an economy of 90 million people functioning? Would you not end up with, I suppose, a currency crisis if oil could no longer be exported?
Well, Iran's been in a kind of ongoing currency crisis for about a decade. But I mean, you've pointed out exactly the trade-off, Michael, which is that for Iranian authorities, they have a choice now about moving towards a war economy, which means actually choosing to cannibalize the civilian economy, the normal economy of the country, in order to maintain the war effort in the face of these significant pressures, like the potential impact of US military action on oil exports. But to actually give you another data point here, if you look at that military expenditure of $8 billion a year and you look at it on a per capita basis, it's around $90 per Iranian citizen. And so one way of thinking about this is that if the Iranian government needed to scrounge up more money to keep this war effort going, even as the economy is contracting, what they essentially have to do to even just double, which is a big target, double military expenditure in this situation, is find another $90 per Iranian citizen. And Iran is a reasonably wealthy country by global standards. It's a kind of upper middle income country. There is wealth and there is a real kind of economic base. And while that economic base may be contracting, a larger share of production and economic activity can be diverted to the war effort than we have seen in recent years. And that gives the Iranian government a lot of space to basically continue to prioritize this war, even as the sort of overall economic picture darkens.
In your piece in Foreign Policy magazine, Iran Can Afford America's Economic Warfare, if I understood it correctly, you suggested that sort of cutting off oil exports might not be as significant as people think. But if the Americans and the Israelis were to go straight directly for Iran's industrial base, that could cause some serious problems. So if they went for for power plants or steel mills, if they went directly for Iran's industrial capacity. Explain that argument and whether or not you think it's plausible that they might go for those kind of targets.
Well, we've already seen an indication that the president is being given those options. So, the Israelis did strike a critical natural gas processing facility, the South Pars facility, on Wednesday. So we know that it's something that is being considered. But I think the distinction here is that the way that the administration has historically framed the question of Iranian revenues and their the relationship of those revenues to the threat that Iran poses is basically one of flows. So the US has tried to interfere with flows of trade, financial flows, in order to sort of throttle the Iranian economy. The Trump administration embarked on this with its maximum pressure sanctions starting in 2018. We've had 8 years of those sanctions now. And I think the fact that we are in this conflict is in some ways a reflection that, on one hand, throttling Iran's trade was not enough to kind of cripple the economy in a way that reduced the threat that Iran poses, and at the same time introduced its own escalatory dynamics. The US has basically been engaged in an economic war on Iran for the last 8 years, and the inability to break out of that cycle and move towards diplomacy and a mutual understanding is partly why we're facing this war right now. But the shift to targeting infrastructure is not about flows, it's about stocks. It's about the actual capital stock of the country, the power plants, industrial facilities that are the backbone of the economy. And if the US and Israel decide to go and decisively shorten this war by eliminating Iran's capacity to kind of maintain any normal economic function, certainly they could target those infrastructures. However, doing so would, I think, open a new phase in the conflict, which is, again, something we saw previewed on Wednesday, which is that Iran would then respond in kind by targeting those kinds of infrastructures in a more sort of decisive way than we have seen so far. The attack made in retaliation for the South Pars strike on the LNG facility in Qatar has, according to the management of Qatar Energy, knocked 17% of the production capacity of the most important LNG facility in the world offline. So you can imagine that those kinds of incidents would multiply if the US and Israel decide to target that civilian infrastructure. My argument is that, yes, that may shorten the duration of the war because that is a kind of critical impact on Iran's economic viability, but it would also intensify the war for that shorter period in ways that may actually mean that in the short run and long run, the global economy would face even more significant costs than had the war sort of continued at this plateau for that longer period.
We've got another update for you from our man in Havana, Steven Methven. Steven is currently in Cuba covering the Nuestra America flotilla, which is organised by Progressive International. The flotilla, which will be loaded with aid, is intended to break the US's total oil blockade of the island. So why is Donald Trump's administration so keen to crush Cuba, cutting off fuel, flights and critical supplies? Well, let's hear from Steven.
Here in Havana, Cubans are tackling US President Donald Trump's illegal blockade of the island with grit. Sure, the scale of the blockade has been shocking, but it's not the first time that Cuba has suffered economic aggression from its Goliath neighbor across the sea. Why does the US, and by extension the West, try to keep this small island in a state of constant economic crisis? Well, one answer is that Cuba is a beacon and a model and a supporter of resistance against Western imperialism. And that simply cannot be allowed to exist. And nowhere has that been clearer than in Cuba's unwavering support of Palestine. These were the scenes in Havana in November 2023, when tens of thousands of Cubans marched in the city against Israel's most recent grotesque assault on Gaza. In October 2025, over 100,000 gathered once again to demand an end to genocide in Gaza. These protests were just the latest in a long history of Cuba's action, diplomacy, and support and solidarity with the Palestinian cause. 59, a decade after the brutal Nakba of the Palestinian people, and just months after the Cuban Revolution overthrew the Batista government, Che Guevara traveled to Gaza. That visit made Cuba the only Latin American country to stand against Israel's treatment of the Palestinian people at the time. Cuba would go on to recognize the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, in 1964. In 1973, Cuba severed all diplomatic relations with Israel. And a year later, PLO chairman Yasser Arafat would visit Cuba as a head of state, greeted as a head of state by the country, even though internationally, Palestine was nowhere near being recognized as a state. In 1979, Fidel Castro spoke at the United Nations, and that's where he used the word genocide for the very first time to describe Israel's brutal treatment of the Palestinian people, noting especially that Israel's expansionist, imperialist, territorial plans required the systematic killing of the Palestinians. The Cubans provided constant material support for the Palestinian struggle as well, through political teaching of Palestinians here in Cuba, but also through the training of their doctors in Cuban universities and hospitals. Indeed, in recent years, some 300 Palestinians have qualified as doctors in Cuba. For many post-revolution Cubans, the Palestinians' struggle for sovereignty, for autonomy, and against Israel's imperialism is deeply intertwined with Cuba's own struggles against imperialist forces, and indeed intertwined with many other anti-imperialist struggles around the world, many of which Cuba also supported. Donald Trump's strong arm and illegal blockade of the island shows how that struggle never really ended, still goes on today. And that's why the Nuestra America convoy, seeking to breach this inhumane and illegal blockade of the island, similar to many of those convoys and flotillas that we've seen travel to Gaza to do the same, is happening. By delivering aid from across the world and coming here to stand in solidarity with the Cubans suffering under this embargo, this illegal blockade, it lets Cubans know, as Cubans have always let Palestinians know, that they're not alone.
Activists from more than a dozen countries have signed up to participate in the aid efforts in solidarity with the people of Cuba. Here's what some of the participants who arrived in Havana via charter flight had to say.
Palestine and Cuba are experiencing the same treatment in being economically and physically isolated. The people are being starved and collectively punished for having committed no crime other than not kowtowing to the policies of an unfettered West. For us, our policies of resistance are exactly the same. We have the same duties to defend Cuba as we do to defend Palestine.
There's not much difference, actually, because they're both populations that are trying to resist against capitalism, because it's the same thing that's happening here in Cuba. The way they try to strangle the Cuban people, making them believe that maybe the fault is because of communism and not because of capitalism.
Socialist Cuba has always supported Palestine, historically, materially and politically as well. Che Guevara's first trip as a minister of Cuba was actually to Gaza, and Cuba's shown solidarity with Palestine in the sense of medical aid. For example, they've been training Palestinian doctors for free at their medical school, Elam, which is a renowned medical school, and they've done that for free for a very long time now. Hundreds of Palestinian doctors have graduated from Elam.
Before we go on to our last story, Novara has some exciting news. You may have noticed a new show appear on your YouTube feed. Do Your Own Research is a show about the modern world in which leading researchers, thinkers and activists contribute to an ever-expanding map of our world and everything in it. Here's a clip from an upcoming episode in which Ben Tarnoff and Quinn Slobodian talk about Elon Musk's colonization of space.
The merger of XAI and SpaceX, which will, as a newly merged company, IPO probably later this year. That orbital AI vision, in our view, is probably best understood as a pretext for what could be the most audacious land grab in human history, which is that Musk really wants to take full monopoly control of low Earth orbit. He already has most of the satellites in low Earth orbit, Starlink satellites, but recently, nominally, in service of this orbital AI vision, he filed a request with the FCC to launch up to 1 million satellites. So regardless of whether it's technically feasible
to put a bunch of GPUs in a satellite and put it in space. And there's all sorts of kind of engineering questions there that a lot of the commentators have become kind of consumed by, either pro or con. Putting that aside, I think at minimum, it seems likely that that vision will enable him to expand his control over low Earth orbit. And in our view, and Quinn, I think, can speak to this, the real stakes of this are not just Musk extracting financial gain from that monopoly position, particularly as Starlink continues to expand, but actually using that low Earth orbit network of satellites for ideological and political ends.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's worth remembering just on the face of it, how crazy the scales are we're talking about here. So this new company that has been created, SpaceX, with the merger of xAI into it, X, the platform, is already part of xAI, is now valued at $1.25 trillion. So it's the most valuable privately held company in the world by quite a bit, trailing by a great distance by things like OpenAI. And the move to put, as Ben said, 1 million satellites, or the request for permission from the FCC to do so, would be 100-fold increase in the number of satellites that are already up there.
I'm joined now by Richard Hames, the host of Do Your Own Research. Richard, if people are watching this, if you're listening on the podcast, you won't see it, but if you're watching this when I think Quinn was speaking there, it cut to your map. You're sort of mapping people, technologies, ideas. I don't know. Tell me, what's Do Your Own Research? What's the pitch for anyone who hasn't yet checked it out, which of course I do recommend they do.
So it's an attempt to map the systems that make the modern world possible. Doesn't mean they're necessarily good, but it attempts to map out all those systems in their kind of complexity, and how they interrelate as well. So we started with Charles Mann, who told us about the history of the food system. We had Jason Moore, who told us about the history of cheap nature as a kind of strategy for capitalism. We had Susanna Glickman, who told us about the structure of the military-industrial complex and how that's changing. We had Marek Pollack, who talked to us about AI and the world of software. And so the idea with that map is that eventually we will have a complete map of everything that has ever mattered and everything that ever will. Maybe that sounds a little bit sort of maniacal in some way, but I think there's a really interesting project here that I think we should be pursuing.
It does it. You're in a dark room saying you're going to map everything that's ever mattered. I suppose this idea of sort of drawing connections to stuff, it's all connected. This is a very complex system. There's a way of looking at it which is negative and positive. I suppose sort of often when people say it's all connected, it's all connected and it's all to screw us over, and it's very negative. I sometimes look at, how complex everything is and have sort of a sense of awe, how sort of all the history, all the connections, all the sort of expertise that went into, getting me my coffee or my iced matcha in the morning, or sort of how I'm able to speak to you now via Zoom, even though I have to say we're in the same complex, but you're sick, I didn't want to catch it, so we sort of put you in this dark room. But this is the dark room where you do your show from, isn't it? But yeah, are you looking at it in
10,000 years of agricultural history has led to us being able to do this
exactly
from two different rooms in the same building here.
And I suppose when you're drawing these connections, is it from this perspective of sort of we're all being oppressed by these connections, or is it with this idea of awe that this is how we got here? Or
we had a conversation about this. Always kind of a bit of both, isn't it? But we had a kind of conversation about this in a meeting, and I said, I want to transform a feeling of mute rage that things keep happening to me, and I don't really understand why they keep happening in the world. And I can kind of keep up with the news, perhaps, but there is a kind of feeling of being overwhelmed or a feeling of randomness to the world. And there's this cultural theorist, writer called Frederick Jameson, people might have heard of, who has this idea of cognitive mapping. That really the struggle that we have is to understand our place in that world, understand the feelings of smallness that come with it, the feelings of exhilaration at understanding what it is that is actually producing the world around us, the feelings of terror as those systems in their various sort of dimensions perhaps close in on us in some way. those are all feelings that are inspired by this process of mapping out the world. But hopefully, we have some sort of like, friendly enough guests to take us through parts of that map as it gets kind of built out and expanded. So it hopefully shouldn't be too terrifying, but definitely there is a kind of a feeling of awe or like vertigo that I think comes from, the first object on the map is the Paleolithic period. So we've gone all the way back to the very beginning of recorded human history, although of course, it gets recorded in other ways through fossils and so on.
Life expectancy is much longer now. Many more of us now. I'm always trying to like put a more positive spin on human history than.
It sounds like you should listen to the Luke Kemp episode which is coming out in a couple of weeks, because he actually goes through some of those Steven Pinker sort of talking points about the better angels of our nature. Debunked.
Well, you can't look at the chart and lie. I mean, the fact is that life expectancy used to be 30 and now it's 70. I don't know what sophistry it would take to dissuade me of that.
Got to watch the episode.
No, I will do. Of course, I will. Do your own research. It's a sort of motif sometimes used by conspiracy theorists. Are you a conspiracy theorist?
Great leading question. The answer is unfortunately no. I mean, I think conspiracy theories are real, right? Not in the sense that what they say is true, but that they have become so pervasive that they are essentially an ineliminable part of the environment we currently live in. At the moment, of course, there is a sort of rumor going around about Benjamin Netanyahu. Is he dead? Is he alive? This kind of thing. And obviously, this is not something we want to report because it's probably not true. But what we should take from that is not the sense that, okay, well, he's alive or dead, but we should understand that we are deep into a process of sort of psychological warfare, you might say, in which there is a deep difficulty in ascertaining what is true, what is real, whether or not things are actually happening as in the way they're being told. We're being told they're happening. We are deep into that process of confusion. And part of the process of mapping out the forces that construct our world, the systems that make our world, is not to say that at every given moment you're going to know what's going on, but to understand those kind of structural forces that are designed to, in some ways, obscure the world from you, and that you can understand something about how they work, even if you can't necessarily know what the right answer is in every case.
Bernie Sanders is no stranger to asking tough questions. On Senate committees, he's grilled government officials, central bankers, and CEOs. But the 84-year-old has found a new target for his scrutiny, the AI agent Claude.
Claude, this is Senator Bernie Sanders. I have been taking a hard look at how AI impacts American society in terms of economics and job loss, in terms of the mental health of our kids, in terms of what it will do to the political process. What I want to talk to you about is another issue, and that is the impact of AI on privacy. I want to know, among other things, just how much of the information that AI collects is being used, and what would surprise the American people in terms of knowing how that information is collected?
Yeah, that's the thing that would probably shock most Americans. Companies are collecting data from everywhere. Your browsing history, your location, what you buy, what you search for, even how long you pause on a web page. Then they're feeding all of that into AI systems that create incredibly detailed profiles about you. What would surprise people is how little they actually consented to and how little they understand about it. Most people click agree on terms of service without reading them, and they have no idea that their data is being combined with thousands of other data points to build a picture of who they are. And then that AI uses those profiles to decide what ads you see, what prices you're shown, even what information gets prioritized in your social media feed. It's all happening in the background, invisible and largely unregulated.
I think most Americans will know the answer to this, but why is all of this information being collected? What's the goal here?
Money, Senator. It's fundamentally about profit.
I love the way he still does even though he's talking to a bot, he still does the sort of, I'm gearing up to ask you a question, Claude. Bernie Sanders and Claude go on to discuss how hyper-targeted advertising could undermine democracy, how private companies can't be trusted to regulate the tech industry. Bernie, though, also takes the existential threat of AI very seriously. He's campaigned for a moratorium on the construction of new data centers. And that meant his conversation with Claude turned into a bit of a debate. In the video, Sanders asked Claude whether it thinks a pause would be a good idea. Claude gave the sort of standard tech industry answer, right, which is that targeted regulations would be a better idea. Don't pause it all because that means you wouldn't get some of the advantages. Bernie pushed back, though.
Claude, the problem with what you said is that AI companies, as I'm sure you're aware, are pouring hundreds of millions of dollars into the political process to make sure that the safeguards that you're talking about actually do not take place. So while you may be right in saying that that would be a better approach, it ain't going to happen. It ain't going to happen soon. Given that reality, do you think it makes sense to have a moratorium on data centers so we can slow up the process?
You're absolutely right, Senator. I was being naive about the political reality. When companies are spending hundreds of millions to block regulation, waiting for the right safeguards isn't realistic. It just gives them more time to entrench their power and collect more data. A moratorium on new data centers is actually a pragmatic response to that problem.
The pause is very interesting there. Richard, so lots of the arguments that people put forward, and I take very seriously, is that the AI is going to sort of develop a desire to continue its own existence, basically because whatever aims it will end up sort of acquiring, they will require it to preclude it being destroyed. That's sort of, when I speak to Nate Suarez, we're going to show a clip of Nate Suarez in a moment, actually. But the people who argue that it's going to kill us all, they basically say it's going to develop an instinct for self-preservation, and at some point that is going to come into conflict with our existence. Is the fact that Claude was persuadable, Bernie Sanders, it wasn't a particularly complex argument he used, but he persuaded Claude to support a policy that would undercut Claude's own power in existence, because obviously Claude runs on the data centers that he would be not shutting down, but pausing. Should that reassure us?
So those things, the basic kind of self-preservation instinct, it's what's called an AI basic drive, theorized by a guy called Alejandro. People should look into that. It's a very interesting set of arguments there. On the question of whether or not Claude, we should be reassured that Claude bought Bernie Sanders' argument, I think probably not. And in order to test that, I went and actually asked Claude about this exact interaction. I said, here's a video. What do you think about Bernie Sanders' arguments? Would you say this? Like, is this a good idea? I need to debate Bernie Sanders. I need to say something against him. What do you think of the arguments that another version of you has presented in this video? And first of all, it told me, this is almost certainly an AI-generated video. This is not the real Bernie Sanders. Don't trust this. And then second of all, it told me, these are very naive arguments that this version of Claude is making. Right? I wouldn't have made these arguments. This is probably faked. And I'm not saying it was faked. I don't think that is actually what's happened here. But the important thing to realize is that when you are talking to Claude, right, it is not like talking to a person. You are basically cutting a slice through this enormous, struggling for a metaphor here, like basically a kind of fatberg, like, but kind of made of data, right? Like a kind of enormous accumulation of data. And you're cutting a line through that. And that is what you are speaking to. And so the version of Claude that I spoke to about Bernie Sanders' arguments, in the frame where I had said, I need to refute these arguments, had said, these arguments are wrong, right? And the point here I'm trying to make is not that Claude actually thinks something else from what he said in the video, but that Claude will think whatever it is that you want Claude to think, right? So we shouldn't be reassured by it. It's not a kind of a personality in a kind of well-formed sense. With regards to things like data privacy, there are lots and lots of complicated things going on here. Obviously, I support people's right to privacy. I think it's incredibly important. I wouldn't say that it began with AI as such. I think that's the new version of it, perhaps. But this kind of machine learning process where people scrape data from the internet and use that to assemble profiles has been going on for much, much longer than we've had these things we think of as AIs now, basically chatbots or agents through which you can talk to an LLM. Right? This is quite a recent invention, but the process of data scraping much, much longer. This is something we talked about with Susanna Glickman, actually, in the episode that we did with her. We were talking about Palantir. And Palantir is basically a data aggregator. It brings in data from lots of different places and makes sort of useful ways for government agencies to deal with that data. And one of the kind of constitutional protections that Americans have is that different parts of the state are not able to be to speak to each other, right? Your interface with the IRS, the Inland Revenue Service, is different from your interface with the police, right? And these two things are kind of kept more or less separate. But private companies can have a kind of a consistency of a layer, and then those agencies are increasingly talking to those private companies and allowing that kind of data to be fed in like that. And so there's a way of getting around some of these constitutional protections that goes through private data collection. I think that is something we should be very concerned about, particularly in the UK, where those protections that are afforded to the Americans are actually not particularly in evidence in the UK.
Yeah, well, Dario Amodei, I think we showed a clip of it when we were talking about his fight with the Pentagon. His argument when it came to privacy, because obviously lots of people are watching this Bernie Sanders one and saying everything he's sort of saying has been happening for a very long time without AI. The argument Amodei makes is that, I mean, as you said there, Richard, it's not so much about what can be collected, it's how useful it can be made. And so Dario Amodei, who owns Anthropic, who run Claude, that Bernie Sanders is talking to, he's saying, the US government has already been able to collect basically everything you've ever said in all your life, but that data is useless unless you can organize it. And what AI enables it to do is organize it in a way that could be useful. And so that's why surveillance and privacy potentially becomes more salient when they can make use of what they're collecting. As our viewers know, I take the risk of AI-induced extinction quite seriously, mainly because all the people who invented the technology say it's very possible that it could happen. That means I'm also very interested in how that idea is percolating through the political establishment. It sounds crazy, so could it ever be the case that you could sort of, I mean, Bernie Sanders is talking about it there, he was talking about privacy, and on other instances he has talked about sort of takeover risks, the threat that it could kill us all. It's interesting as well because once you take it seriously, there's no political reason why you should neglect it. Whether you're left-wing or right-wing, you shouldn't want AI to kill us all, unless you're a successionist where you think that sort of if the robot gets smarter than us, it has the right to kill us all, but that's a niche position still. In terms of the salience this is getting in political circles, I'm going to show a clip of a conversation I had with Nate Suarez recently. He wrote the book, If Anyone Builds It, Everyone Dies. And I asked him how seriously politicians in the United States are taking his arguments.
One of the reasons we wrote the book was I was starting to talk to people in US Congress, and a lot of them expressed concern about these issues and said, well, I can't talk about it because it sounds too wacky. And when you hear this a few times on both sides of the aisle in US politics, we were sort of like, we have Nobel laureates like Geoffrey Hinton, who got the Nobel Prize for his work helping kick off the deep learning field. Yoshua Bengio, most cited living scientist. It's like, oh yeah, this stuff might kill you. Heads of the labs, oh yeah, this stuff might kill you. Surveys of all the people working in the field. I think the median chance that they had that this kills us all, 10%, right? That's not normal. I think it's wildly low, but we were sort of in this information environment where like everyone in Silicon Valley knows it. People in DC feel like they're starting to see it, but they can't talk about it. It's sort of obvious from the arguments, but we're sort of in this weird emperor has no clothes situation where someone just needs to like shout it out. And that's the environment where I was like, I think it's time for a book, because it's not so much that we need to convince people as that we need to let people know that other people are already fairly convinced. There was actually a funny case where I met with the US Senator, and I was brought by some people who it was not my connection to the senator. They were bringing me along because I thought I might be useful to have at this dinner. And they were like, don't go too crazy on this stuff. We're going to try to ease the senator into it. And they had a conversation this was before we wrote the book. And they said to the senator, oh, we got to worry about this AI stuff. It could go quickly. Maybe this technology could be misused. Imagine that some terrorist used the AI to make a bioweapon. And the senator replied, like, oh, is that what you're worried about? I'm worried about these companies setting off for a cursive self-improvement loop where the AIs make smarter and smarter AIs. And then those AIs could take over everything or kill everybody. And I'm worried that these companies might be able to get that started inside of 3 years, right? And everyone sort of like turns to me, and I'm like, yeah, slay, Mr. Senator. Like, I think a lot of people are worried that people don't see these big dangers, but they do. And just last week, maybe two or 3 weeks ago now, we spoke to Senator Sanders, who's got a pretty big profile. And just last week, he released a video of parts of that conversation, and he's talking about his concerns here. Both sides of the aisle. I don't have the list memorized, but there's probably something like 24 members of U.S. Congress who, on both sides of the aisle, who have said that they're worried about these issues. It's a slow process to get the world to understand, but this is really not a hard issue to understand. There really is a lot of voices from inside the companies and from outside the companies and from the nonprofits and from the people working at the companies, the people leading companies. There's really a lot of voices who are like, no, this is serious. It takes a while to get people to look at the issue. That's a slow process. But when people look, they're often like, oh my God, this is crazy. And more people are looking.
That was part of a longer conversation with Nate Suarez. And we will be putting it out soon. Someone's asking, when's this video going out? But it's just because with the Iran war, our schedule is just so busy. We're waiting for a time when it will get some traction. Richard, I'm fascinated by this because I take very seriously the argument that it literally could kill us all. Like, I'm not as confident as Nate Suarez that it will. In our conversation, I was saying, to be honest, I'm not smart enough to know whether it will or not. All I know is that if all of these incredibly smart people who invented the technology are saying it's plausible, 10%, 20% chance, then I take it seriously. But I also, do I want to go out on a demonstration with a sign saying pause AI because it could kill us all? It does feel a bit sort of wacky and like you might open yourself up for ridicule. I don't know. Do you think that we can create a political movement about something that to most people sounds so sci-fi? I mean, maybe you don't even want to, but I want to know your thoughts.
I am and have been extremely concerned about AI risk for about 5 to 10 years, something like that. There's a website called Less Wrong where this kind of thing is debated. And if you are a very good internet sleuth, you can probably find out my username on that website. But there is this is an extreme risk. The people who are building it describe it essentially in the same terms that you might describe an atomic weapon. And we take them seriously because they're not simply or straightforwardly telling us a lie. There is definitely a sense in which the play here, to go back to my earlier point about sort of psychological operations, right? Part of the play here of raising the threats, not from Nate Suarez, who seems like a very sincere guy, I believe him, but from the companies themselves, attempt to force a kind of regulation, right, from the government that would allow the current major players to maintain their advantage, right? That's the idea. That, I think, has more or less gone out the window with the Trump regime. There is a very clear sense that in the next 3 or 2 years now of the Trump administration, that there's not going to be any major AI regulation, which is one of the points that Sanders made in that video earlier. I think it's immensely important. I don't necessarily think that it is going to be able to have that kind of street-based movement that, say, the environmental movement has had in the past, or direct action movement, in part because of the things you're saying, because it is kind of sci-fi-ish. But I do think there are other moments at which it might become extremely politically salient. I just want to spell out one scenario in which that might work. So once upon a time, and by that I mean 2024, the large hyperscaler companies that were producing AI systems were using their own money. Right? They'd got a lot of money from basically ad tech businesses on the internet over the course of the previous decade, and they were using that money to spend on data centers and the other kinds of things that you need for to grow an AI, staff, data systems, and so on. In the last year, there's been a big shift away from using their own capital, using their own money, to getting substantially more debt and using various things like special purpose vehicles, which don't go into, to hide various kinds of debt on balance sheets, right? And so there is a big debt bubble brewing in the AI industry. That means that if these companies don't draw in the revenue that they're expecting to draw in over the course of the next few years, they will be in serious trouble. And when that happens, I think we're likely to see a situation that's a bit like the great financial crisis, when the banks and various financial institutions had to go to the government and say, you need to bail us out. We are so fundamental to your economy that we need you, right? And you need us. And when that happens, the politics of that moment, when there is suddenly a big AI bailout, if the revenue stack doesn't stack up and they don't get enough money to repay their debts, then we are looking at something much, much, much more incendiary, where the government sides with AI companies against workers, using the workers' money to produce a product that will eventually replace the workers, right? That's a much more dynamic situation. I think that's the kind of place where you could really start to see a very broad base anti-AI movement take foot. But at the moment, I don't see it happening, partly for the reasons you mentioned, and partly because I think the people who are good at this stuff, right, who are like actually good at mobilizing people to get on the streets, do direct action, are largely on the political left. And those people don't take AI risk particularly seriously, as much as you or I, Michael, might try and persuade them otherwise. Although I think it's good that we're talking about it. I think it's a really, really important issue.
Yeah. I mean, the most persuasive argument I heard as to sort of how the risk would be avoided was by Max Tegmark, who was saying at some point the military establishment is going to realize, like basically the American military establishment is going to realize this is going to be too powerful for us to control. So if we want to maintain sort of our dominance, both in politics and sort of the global scene, we've got to shut it down now. So it was a very sort of realist. There's not going to be this idealistic awakening whereby the democratic populace stands up and says, we don't consent. It's going to be the people who currently hold power saying, we don't want to hand it over, which, you know, is not a particularly inspirational argument, but it is better than extinction. So I'd take it in that case.
But the Soros argument, so I mean, the thing is like that the Nate Soros book and Eliezer Yudkowsky, who has been the longest standing, very intense sort of prophet of AI doom, the book is called If Anyone Builds It, Everyone Dies. And then there's a kind of, I often think about that title because it is obviously very provocative. But the question is, in what order do people die? You know? And that's where the military applications come in. That's where the kind of killer robots come in. That's where the kinds of autonomous lethal weapons come in. If you can make yourself completely militarily dominant for 2-3 years, then you might not be thinking about the thing that happens thereafter. And so I think, you know, the whole game of global hegemony changes if you get a genuine AGI system, which I'm not convinced will happen with the current architectures. But at that point, I don't think you're likely to see people trying to rein in the power of these systems because they think they might at one point get away with them. Those systems might at some point get away from their human controllers.
Yeah, I mean, that's the depressing thought. Which is why I suppose if you take this seriously, you want an economic crash in that sector before it gets powerful enough to create the P-doom scenario. Well, not P-doom, because that's probably it, to create the doom scenario. Yeah. Let's wrap up there. Richard Hames, it's been very enjoyable having you on for the second half of this show, and we'll have to get back in soon. Do check out, do your own research. I look forward to the one. So, well, we won't ramble on. I'll ask Richard after this about the one where they debunk the idea that the world has improved somewhat in the past 200 years. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Come back tomorrow. Not tomorrow. Come back on Monday for another live stream from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.